Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
Support comes from Mercedes-Benz of Buckhead, where the power of electric meets the power of Mercedes. Introducing a lineup of electric vehicles, the EQB, the EQS sedan and SUV, the EQE sedan and SUV. The vehicles are all electric. The feeling is all Mercedes. Mercedesofbuckhead.com.
I'm not a fearful person. God has not given me the spirit of fear, and I think I can do this.
They watched election workers face abuse in 2020, and it's compelling them to serve in 2024.
And lawmakers hear from Republican states in the South that took the plunge on Medicaid expansion.
It was not a very pleasant journey early on because I was one of the few Republicans. And I would tell you, you need to be patient, but don't give up.
And the effort to legalize online sports betting gets complicated.
I'm WAB politics reporter Sam Greenglass.
And I'm politics reporter Raul Bally. It's week 4 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is Dome Scramble, a pop-up podcast about the legislature and more from Political Breakfast and WAB News in Atlanta. Okay, Raul, before we get into the nitty-gritty, there are a couple things I want to raise with you this week. And one is the gorgeous view from the 20th floor of the Sloppy Floyd building across from the Capitol. It just took my breath away. I wonder, have you been up there before?
Absolutely. It is really one of my favorite views. I'm actually sitting in another one of my favorite views. It's the South Anteroom of the Georgia House. From here, you can see Atlanta City Hall and the Fulton County Courthouse. But you know, that view from Sloppy Floyd is absolutely breathtaking. You even tweeted it out. So if people want to see the view that you're talking about, go to Sam's Twitter.
And, you know, our podcast is called Dome Scramble. That gold dome we're talking about, it is regal and beautiful and just shines in the sunlight, and we are so grateful for it. Another thing that is golden or yellow, cornbread, which is on its way to becoming the new state bread of Georgia, according to a House committee I attended this week. There was a bill sponsored by Representative Casey Carpenter to make cornbread the state bread of Georgia. It passed pretty unanimously, so I don't expect controversy on the House floor. We usually save the food stuff for our pal Rose Scott on Closer Look, but I had to flag that for you before we get into the hard stuff.
You know, Sam, your story put a smile on my face, especially this week, because, you know, it's been a difficult week around here. We've had the deaths of Georgians here and overseas weighing on the minds of many. Governor Brian Kemp took the rare step of coming to the House floor this week to speak after the death of Republican State Representative Richard Smith.
As you all know, this has been a difficult week for our state. We have lost some of our very finest as we continue to mourn Trooper Jimmy Sindikar, our brave Americans that we lost in a drone attack in Georgia, Jordan, Sergeant William Rivers of Carrollton, Specialist Kennedy Sanders from Waycross, Specialist Brianna Moffitt from Savannah, and now our valued friend and colleague and a great leader in Chairman Richard Smith. On behalf of a grateful Georgia, we appreciate their service to our state and nation.
Now, Smith was the chairman of the powerful House Rules Committee, which decides what legislation is voted on in the full House. He died suddenly of complications of the flu. His funeral is now set for Monday, which means there's been a schedule change here. We will not be in session on Monday, and that will be made up on February the 16th.
Okay, Raul, in that same speech, Governor Kemp told lawmakers that Chairman Smith would want the work to continue. And even on the day of his death, members of the House did pass a couple of bills. So the work of lawmaking goes on. Now, let's talk about some major legislation that did move forward this week. And one of them was the legalization of sports betting in Georgia, but it's not quite as straightforward as it might sound.
No, it is not, Sam. It was a bit of a surprise in the state Senate. So the original version of Senate Bill 386 legalized sports betting by allowing it under the Georgia lottery. 20% of the income from 16 licensed operators would go to the Hope Scholarship and pre-K programs. By doing it under the Georgia lottery, that means It only needed a simple majority to pass in the House and Senate, and it did not need a voter referendum from Georgia voters.
Okay, Raul, this sounds straightforward enough, but then a Republican senator threw a little bit of a wrench in the situation. Tell me what happened.
Republican State Senator Bill Cowsert offered an amendment that passed, and it adds the requirement for a constitutional amendment. Here's what that means. Now there needs to be a 2/3 majority of lawmakers to place a constitutional amendment on the ballot, and then Georgia voters need to approve it. Here's Cowsert talking on the Senate floor.
To pass this bill without making it be contingent upon the voters of this state being allowed to weigh in and approve it is disingenuous at best and just sneaky to try to circumvent the voters of the state of Georgia. And I don't understand why we would want to do that.
And we also talked to State Senator Clint Dixon, who is the sponsor of Senate Bill 386. We talked to him after the vote.
With the bipartisan support in the Senate, and I believe it will, show the same measure in the House, does give me some hope. And also, I mean, we're still, this is the first, passage out of the Senate, but we've got to go through the process in the House. And a lot of things can change with a bill. So, it's in the House's, the House hands now. And then, who knows if we end up in a Congress committee. So, I mean, the bill could be totally different than, what it is leaving the Senate. So I'm still hopeful we'll get it across the finish line this year.
Is there a path to legalize sports betting in Georgia still? Yes. Is it harder? Yes. Senate Bill 386 now heads over here where I'm sitting in the State House.
So more drama ahead.
You're absolutely right. Now, talking about elections and voting, Sam, I want to talk about your reporting this week on efforts to recruit poll workers to work in the 2024 elections in Fulton County. Now, many of our listeners will know the story of the mother-daughter election team of Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. They were targeted by then-President Donald Trump and his allies in 2020. You think the conventional thinking would be that people would see that and be discouraged from signing up to be election workers. But Sam, you found out that's not the case.
That's right, Raul. Fulton County has filled all 2,300 election day positions, and that's not just for November. It is for all of the other many elections that we have here in Georgia. I recently went to one of the recruitment fairs. This one was in College Park in this wood-paneled community rec center, and that's where I caught up with LaShondra Little. She's Fulton County's voter education and outreach manager.
We actually haven't had to convince people. People literally have been calling, asking how can they sign up. Even this room, when we first got here at 9, people beat us here.
Now, Raul, the county is still recruiting for advanced voting and reserve staff, but this comes at a time when election officials, and I should add judges, juries, public health workers, are increasingly having to think about things like threats of violence. A recent Brennan Center study found that half of election workers worry that the political climate will make it harder to recruit and retain staff and volunteers. But experts I talk to say that election offices are finding creative ways to respond to this challenge.
Hey, Sam, did you talk to some of these folks that are signing up to serve? What did they say to you?
Yeah, I met two longtime friends, Gloria Smith and Vanita Epps. They've both been poll workers for more than 2 decades. And like Evelyn Myers, the woman you heard from at the very top of the show, the abuse faced by election workers after 2020, it actually made them want to serve more. Epps said some of this stems from echoes of the past. Her parents were involved in a voting rights suit that actually went to the U.S. Supreme Court after they were denied the ability to register to vote in Terrell County in 1957.
Every time I get ready to go and start another election, I think about the words of my mom and how she always said to me, I don't feel no ways tired. That means even when it seems like there are obstacles in your way, like it was back in 1957, you don't get tired when you feel like that there's a good work that needs to be accomplished.
Raul, I think these stories both underscore the unsung heroes of our democracy and also what's at stake in this particular political climate looking ahead to the 2024 election.
And Sam, before we take a break, I want to talk about some budget action that we're expecting here next week. As we've said in the past, the one thing state lawmakers must do is pass a state budget. What we're talking about here is the amended 2024 state budget, which is currently funding government until June 30th. What I'm hearing is the House version, the changes made by the House to the governor's original proposal, are expected to be on the House floor. We're going to see what kind of changes they made. It will likely get a vote before it heads over to the Senate.
All right, let's take a break here. When we come back, we'll talk to WABE health reporter Jess Mador about Medicaid expansion and her reporting on how Georgia is handling opioid settlement money. This is Dome Scramble from WABE.
Hey y'all, I'm Mark Kendall.
And I'm David Perdue.
And we're the hosts of What's Good Atlanta, the new weekly comedy podcast from WABE.
On What's Good Atlanta, we run down uplifting and unusual headlines from the universe known as Atlanta.
And while we may not be journalists, we are comedians, and we'll be breaking down news and breaking down the stories that make you smile.
We're just trying to see what's good, Atlanta.
Episodes drop Fridays at WABE.org or wherever you get your podcasts. I get mine from a guy named Craig.
Shout out to Craig.
Mm-hmm.
WABE. Ever wondered where to find the best dumplings in town? Curious about Atlanta's obsession with lemon pepper? Join us on Savory Stories, a new podcast as we uncover the untold tales behind Atlanta's culinary scene. From the roots of your favorite dishes to the creators that bring them to life, we're diving deep into the heart of the city's food culture. Listen to Savory Stories at wabe.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. WABE.
Welcome back to Dome Scramble. Here with us now is WABE health reporter Jess Mador. Hey, Jess.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Jess, you've done some really cool and interesting things before you came here to WABE. You covered military veterans' mental health and reintegration into civilian life after combat. You've done addiction and opioid epidemic. You've done a documentary series on the impacts of opioids on mothers and child health in Appalachia. You've done criminal justice system coverage in East Tennessee. What attracts you to this kind of reporting?
Thank you, Raul. I'm not sure. I'd say I love reporting that, hopefully gets beyond just the usual headlines and helps to illuminate the realities that people are facing in their lives and with their health.
Jess, before we get to your new opioid reporting, I want to spend a few minutes on Medicaid expansion. There's talk of an opening for a deal to finally expand Medicaid this session. And as you know, Georgia is one of only 10 states that has not expanded Medicaid. Can you just remind us, what exactly does it mean when we say expand Medicaid? And what would it do? Who would be covered if that were to happen?
Well, through the Affordable Care Act, which is also known as Obamacare, state Medicaid expansion allows states to expand insurance coverage for uninsured adults with incomes up to 138% of the federal poverty line. That's about $20,000 a year for an individual person. And it also gives states a big financial incentive for participating in expansion. So it's more funding that comes to states to help offset the cost of expanding Medicaid coverage. And as we know, Governor Brian Kemp's program is a limited Medicaid expansion called Pathways to Coverage. That program is the only program in the nation to require a work or education requirement in exchange for Medicaid coverage, but that program only covers people up to 100% of federal poverty, and it's a relatively smaller number of people who would qualify for the program.
We'll talk a little bit more about Governor Kemp's program here in a moment, but Sam, you covered an interesting panel up here at the Capitol this week where lawmakers had a chance to hear from policymakers from Arkansas and North Carolina, two southern states with Republican-controlled legislatures that have now expanded Medicaid. What struck you, Sam?
Well, first, let me introduce you to Doug Lambreth. He's a North Carolina Republican representative who spent almost a decade trying to convince his colleagues in North Carolina to expand Medicaid. And he says that task was pretty lonely a lot of the time. But one thing he said helped a lot was sharing the stories of people he talked to all around the state.
tree farmers in Ashe County, the strawberry farmers down east. The theme that they all told me, we don't have health insurance, but we have a family farm that we're going to lose if we were to have a catastrophic event.
And Raul, Jess, as you know, North Carolina has become the most recent state to expand Medicaid. They did it last year. And one other thing that Lamberth said is he didn't use words like Medicaid expansion when he was trying to push his colleagues to do this. He says Medicaid expansion has kind of become this dirty word. Instead, he used phrases like closing the coverage gap. Now, I want to, before we move on, drive due west to Arkansas. This is a state that Georgia Republicans have pointed to as a model. Arkansas does something really interesting where instead of allowing more people to access Medicaid coverage directly, what they do is use that funding to purchase low-income people plans on the private market. Former Arkansas Health Secretary Cindy Gillespie said that has pumped lots of money into rural health systems. And then she said something that caught lawmakers' attention.
In the surrounding states, 58 hospitals close. None are in Arkansas.
And as we know, there are several rural hospitals in Georgia that have closed or have been threatened with closure. So this is something that has gotten a lot of lawmakers here in Georgia listening.
So Sam, Raul, I try to follow the policy. You guys follow the politics. So is this really likely to happen this year that we could see Medicaid expansion in Georgia?
Great question. I don't think it is one that anyone really has an answer to, but I also put this question to Republican Senator Chuck Hofstetler, who was on this panel that we've been talking about. And he told me he believes there is still time to get this done. And he said it's true that some Republicans are starting to see this issue differently after many years of really pushing back on this idea of Medicaid expansion.
The numbers show that we're being penny wise and pound foolish if we don't go forward with this.
And I will say that some Republican lawmakers did attend this panel discussion, including one of the governor's floor leaders and the chair of the House Health Committee.
Now, Sam, here's something interesting. That exact same day as the panel that you went to, U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock was also at the state capitol. He addressed senators on the Senate floor. He also spoke with reporters. And a lot of that conversation revolved around the idea of expanding Medicaid from a federal point of view.
Senator Ossoff and I secured, through the American Rescue Plan, $1.2 billion with a B in additional incentives for the state of Georgia to expand. So whatever costs there are to expand, there's $1.2 billion sitting on the table right now.
But as we mentioned, one of the key figures in all of this is Governor Kemp and where he stands. And I directly asked Governor Kemp back in December about this idea of a deal which would involve expanding Medicaid in Georgia with hospital reforms called CON, Certificate of Need Reform.
You'll have to talk to the people that are proposing that. I mean, those are not my proposals. People have known what my plan is. We've implemented that, and we're continuing to work, even though the Biden administration has fought us regulatorily on that and also in the courtroom. So that is what I'm pushing forward on. That's what I campaigned on, and that's what we're continuing to work on.
So there you can hear Kemp talking about, his plan. And what he's talking about there is Pathways to Coverage. That's the work requirement program for a limited expansion of Medicaid. And that program has had a really slow rollout so far. The numbers are far below the state's initial projections for how many people they thought could qualify for that program. But the governor and other top Republicans continue to say they want to give the program more time to catch on.
Yeah, I think it's a couple thousand people that have signed up for Georgia Pathways so far compared to the something around 400,000 people that advocates say would be eligible for coverage under full Medicaid expansion. And, Jess, it's something I feel like I've heard from many Republicans at the Capitol out of one side talking about openness to this idea of full expansion, but still not wanting to ruffle any feathers and touting the promise of Georgia Pathways. Before we move on, Jess, just one other topic I know you are closely watching that I want to raise, and that's maternal mortality. I'm curious if you could just give us a little bit of insight into how far Georgia still has to go to address this challenge and whether there are any glimmers of progress. Are lawmakers looking to take any action this session?
There have been glimmers of progress. There have been real changes that the state has implemented. Last year, for example, state lawmakers put into place an extension of Medicaid coverage for women after they give birth. So for 12 months postpartum, they'll be covered by Medicaid. That was something that came about, because the numbers are just really staggering. And the first year after pregnancy can be really dangerous for a lot of women. So that took effect. But the state's maternal mortality numbers are they're some of the worst in the nation still. So there's a long way to go. But it's clear that lawmakers, on both sides of the aisle are talking about this, are thinking about this. House Democrats already held a public hearing that drew more than 100 people who testified about the impact of maternal mortality. And that happened before this session even began. And now we have Republican State Representative Lauren Daniel from Locust Grove, which is about an hour south of Atlanta. And she's introduced a package of legislation that she says would improve maternal and infant health. And, that's interesting symbolically that we have a Republican lawmaker from outside the metro area who recently had a baby herself, who is, focusing on maternal health issues. But it really remains to be seen what lawmakers have the appetite to pass this session.
Jess, I want to turn now to your reporting on opioids. You report that hundreds of millions of dollars are coming into Georgia as part of the opioid drug maker settlement between states and top opioid manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacies. Can you just put some numbers on the scope of what we're talking about here?
This is the second largest settlement of its kind since the settlement with Big Tobacco. And under the opioid settlements, Georgia is getting $636 million over a period of the next 18 years. 75% of that will go to the state. 25% will go to local governments around the state. And under Georgia's agreement that it's laid out, 40% of the state's share of that funding has to be spent on a regional basis. There's a complicated formula that divides the state into different regions and some metrics that look at the impacts of the opioid crisis in those regions, and that will determine, how much they get in those regional areas.
Hey, Jess, what could the money be spent on?
So under the agreement, it's mandated that the money goes to, quote, approved purposes. This includes stuff like addiction prevention programs, harm reduction, including Narcan, treatment, and recovery. Here's Kevin Tanner. He's head of Georgia's Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. He is also the administrator for Georgia's $636 million fund.
We all have someone we know in our community that's been touched by addiction. And I think that by implementing the opioid settlement, we're going to have a positive impact on all of those that have struggled with addiction.
Yeah, it is striking to hear the impact that it has had on so many communities here in Georgia. Jess, Georgia is not the only state getting this money. How does Georgia's approach compare to all of these other states?
Well, under the nationwide settlement agreement, states are required to spend a minimum of the dollars that they get on opioid remediation. This money is intended to help states recoup some of the costs associated with responding to the opioid crisis. These are the reasons they sued drug makers, distributors, and retailers in the first place. So from what we know, at least so far, Georgia's plan looks pretty typical.
Jess, you write that one of the best historical examples to look at is what happened with Big Tobacco in the 90s. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from that experience?
The Big Tobacco settlements that people may remember, from back in the 90s was the biggest civil litigation settlement in U.S. history. It was massive. It makes the opioid settlement look tiny. But less than 3% of that money was spent on public health programs, for things like cancer research and research into other smoking related diseases, education, and smoking prevention programs. For example, a U.S. Government Accountability Office report found Georgia used some of its tobacco money for things like rural sewer and water projects. So I spoke to some experts about the big tobacco settlement to try and understand some of the lessons we could take from that as we see this opioid settlement rolling out. And here's a little bit of that. This is Professor Nanette Turner. She is an associate dean and professor at the College of Health Professions at Mercer University. And she's analyzed how Georgia has spent its more than $3 billion worth of tobacco settlement funds.
They weren't specified specifically for public health purposes. If you don't set aside the guidelines before you actually get the money, then you're going to see it being used for, whatever the lawmakers feel like they need the money for at any given time. And that's kind of what happened with those tobacco dollars.
So important to learn from history as it relates to policy today. Jess, you cover health. I wonder if what you've learned from covering the opioid settlement illuminates anything else about Georgia's approach to public health in other realms, whether it's mental health, maternal mortality, or access to health coverage.
Well, when looking at the big picture of the opioid settlement as just one example, that money is going to be spent across Georgia over the next 2 decades. So it can take time before the results are really clear, but short-term changes in policy can also go a really long way and help a lot of people in the meantime.
WABE health reporter Jess Mador, thank you so much for your expertise and sharing your reporting with us.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this week. Gold Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers, and our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
And you can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast podcast. And check out wabe.org/underthegoldome for more news. We'll be back next week.